The Varric Dominion had ruled 40 star systems for over 300 years. They had crushed rebellions, absorbed entire civilizations, and stripped hundreds of worlds of every resource worth taking. Their warships were the largest in the known galaxy. Their soldiers were feared across every trade route and star lane, and their High Council had never once been told the word no by anyone who survived long enough to repeat it. The council met on the capital world of Varric Prime, and inside a chamber so vast that its ceiling disappeared into shadow. 12 high lords sat around a curved obsidian table, each one representing a sector of the Dominion, and at the head of the table sat Grand Lord Vane Arak, the oldest and most powerful of them all. He had ruled for 60 years, and in that time he had seen empires rise and fall like waves against a shore. And nothing in the known galaxy had ever given him reason to feel anything close to fear. On this particular day, the Council was reviewing a new intelligence report. It had been compiled by the Dominion's finest analysts over several years, and it concerned a small, unremarkable planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. The planet was called Earth, and it was home to a species called humans. "They have one planet," said High Lord Kreith, scrolling through the data with a bored expression on his wide gray face. "One moon, no permanent colonies beyond their own solar system. Their fastest ships take months to cross between stars. They have no galactic alliances, no treaties with elder species, no planet-class weapons. By every measure of power we use, they are nothing." Vane Arak studied the report with his 4 pale eyes. He turned several pages, paused on a section, then set it down. "And yet," he said slowly, "the Torathi gave them a 50-light-year buffer zone. The Soren Collective refuses to send ships within 3 systems of their space. The Delvari Empire, which has fought and won wars against species 10 times more powerful than these humans, will not even open a trade route in their direction. Why?" Nobody had a good answer. The analysts had noted the same pattern but could not explain it. Elder civilizations, species that had been navigating the stars for thousands of years, treated Earth's sovereignty like an unspoken law carved into the fabric of the universe itself. They did not attack humanity. They did not threaten humanity. They simply stayed away, quietly and without explanation. At the way you stay away from something that you once saw, do something you have never been able to forget. "Superstition," said High Lord Kreith. "Old species develop old fears. They see patterns that are not there. It means nothing. Or it means something we cannot yet see," said a quieter voice at the far end of the table. It belonged to diplomat Sorvak, and a thin and careful man who had spent 40 years studying interspecies relations and had developed the habit of saying things that the Council did not want to hear. "I have reviewed every available record of every civilization that has ever come into conflict with Earth. The records are incomplete, but what remains is unusual." "Unusual how?" asked Vane Arak. "The conflicts are always brief," said Sorvak. "And the aggressor always loses. Not always in battle. Sometimes economically, sometimes politically. Sometimes the aggressor simply collapses from within, years after the conflict ends, unraveling in ways that cannot easily be tied back to any single cause, but always seem to trace their roots to the moment they chose to push against Earth. I cannot prove causation, but the pattern is consistent. Every single time." High Lord Kreith waved a hand. "Coincidence. Every aggressor in history eventually loses. That proves nothing about humans specifically." Sorvak did not argue. He had learned long ago that the Council heard what it wanted to hear. And what the Council wanted to hear today was that Earth was a simple problem with a simple solution. Vane Arak made his decision before the meeting was over. Earth would be absorbed into the Dominion. It was not a question of if, but of how quickly. The planet had resources worth taking, a population worth conscripting. and at a location that would serve as a useful outpost on the outer edge of Varak expansion. For the mission the Council selected, Supreme Commander Drath Vel. He was experienced, capable, and reliable. He had subjugated 11 worlds in his career, and had never once required reinforcement or revision to his orders. The assignment was considered so routine that the Council did not send their finest fleet. They sent a mid-tier force, 40 warships strong, which was more than enough to reduce a single planet species to submission. Drath Vel received the assignment in his office and read the mission brief twice. Then he set it aside and went back to the report he had been reading before, because in his estimation the Earth mission required no further study. He had done this 11 times. He would do it again. It would be finished in a week. What irritated him more than anything was that the assignment felt like an insult. Mid-tier fleet, a single planet, no known defenses worth noting. This was work for a junior commander, not a decorated veteran. He said as much to his second-in-command, a tall officer named Grethak, who agreed with him completely. The Council must think very little of your abilities if they send you to manage a primitive world, she said. Or they think very little of the target, said Drath Vel. Either way, we will be done before the season turns. Before the fleet departed, Drath Vel reviewed the most recent long-range scans of the Sol system. Earth's yellow sun, 8 planets, a scattering of moons and asteroid belts, some orbital stations, limited military signatures, nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested the humans had any real capacity for serious resistance. What he did notice, briefly, was that every sensor sweep of the inner Sol system came back slightly too clean, too empty, in the way that a room looks too tidy when someone has hidden everything before a guest arrives. He flagged it as a possible sensor calibration issue and moved on without giving it another thought, because 40 warships did not need to concern themselves with tidiness. His fleet departed Varak Prime on a clear morning. 40 ships in tight formation, and their engines leaving bright trails across the dark. Drath Vel stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Keth Mara, and watched his home world shrink behind him. He felt nothing particular about this mission. It was routine. It would be finished, and then he would ask for something more worthy of his record somewhere far across the galaxy, on a blue and green planet orbited by one pale moon. A monitoring station picked up the energy signature of 40 Varak warships entering their approach vector. An automated alert reached a small office in a building near a gray ocean. A human officer named Sarah Voss read the alert, leaned back in her chair, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached forward and began typing. Not a distress call, not a request for help, just a set of very calm and very specific instructions going out to systems that had been waiting quietly for exactly this kind of morning. The kind of morning that those who prepared had always known would eventually come. The Varak fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system like 40 gray fists unclenching in the dark. Their ships were enormous, each one bristling with weapon arrays and shielded in layers of battle-hardened alloy, from the bridge of the Keth Mara. And Drath Vel looked out at the distant yellow star the humans called their sun, and felt the familiar quiet satisfaction of a predator arriving exactly where it intended to be. Begin standard approach, he said. Broadcast surrender terms on all frequencies. The broadcast went out in 17 languages, including the 3 most common human tongues. It was a simple message, the same one the Dominion had used for centuries. Surrender your government. Open your orbital stations. It had been for every species before. That had been for every species before 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 that had been for every species. 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 Before that had made the mistake of choosing the second option. Grethak monitored the communications array and waited. Usually there was a response within minutes. Fear was fast. And the sight of 40 Varek warships was enough to produce fear in almost any species that had ever seen what those ships could do to a city, a continent, or a world. The response came in 6 minutes. It was a single hail request, clean and direct, no background noise, no panic anywhere in the transmission. Grethak raised an eyebrow and patched it through to the main screen. The face that appeared was human, a woman, middle-aged by human standards, with short dark hair and a uniform that carried several rows of insignia along the chest. Her expression was composed in the way that a stone wall is composed, not performing calm, not struggling to contain something underneath, just genuinely, completely, unhurried. She was not afraid, and she was not even trying to pretend otherwise. "I am Admiral Sarah Voss of the Earth Defense Authority," she said. "You have entered sovereign human space without invitation or declaration. You have 72 hours to reverse your course and leave this system. We will not ask again." Drathvel stared at the screen for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, short and sharp, the kind that comes from actual surprise rather than performance. He had received many responses to surrender broadcasts over the years. Desperate pleas, angry defiance, confused silence, an immediate capitulation. But he had never received what sounded like a calendar reminder delivered by someone who had other things scheduled for the afternoon. "She speaks as though she has a fleet behind her," he said to Grethak. "Sensors show nothing significant," said Grethak. Some orbital platforms, older design, light defensive armament, nothing that would survive contact with our forward guns for more than a few minutes. Drathvel nodded slowly. He looked at Admiral Voss still, waiting on the screen with that same steady expression, and made a decision, not to respond with words but with demonstration. This was standard Dominion practice, and it was effective without exception. Words of defiance always crumbled when the thing backing them was shown to be nothing, and the best way to show that was to demonstrate what resistance would cost before resistance actually began. Target the human moon, he said. Primary array. A single strike. A surface impact. Enough to leave a crater visible from the planet below. The order was carried out in seconds. One of the Keth Mara's primary weapon arrays rotated, charged, and fired a single focused beam at the moon. It struck the surface and threw up a vast, slow plume of rock and dust that bloomed outward in silence, visible even at this distance, and a wound in the gray surface that would be visible from Earth with the naked eye. That very night, Drathvel looked back at the screen. Admiral Voss had watched the impact. Her expression had not changed. Not a flinch, not a tightening of the jaw, and not the slightest shift in the steadiness of her eyes. She watched the bloom of debris expand in the silence of space, and then she looked back at him as if she had just watched the weather change outside a window. "You have 71 hours and 53 minutes remaining," she said, and ended the transmission. Drathvel sat very still for a moment. He had used this tactic against 9 different species, and every single one had responded with visible fear, with broken voices, with immediate shifts in their tone and posture. This was the first time the only response had been an updated countdown. "She is performing bravery," said Grethak. "It is a psychological tactic. She wants us to believe that she is not afraid, so that we question ourselves." "Perhaps," said Drathvel. But something small and quiet in the back of his mind had shifted slightly. Yet the way a gear slips a tooth, and you do not notice it until later when the machine begins to grind. What Drathvel did not know, and what no instrument on any of his 40 ships was built to detect, was what had happened in the 11 seconds after his fleet crossed the heliopause at the outer boundary of the solar system. 17 separate automated signals had gone out from Earth, and encoded in quantum-layered bursts that moved in different directions across the galaxy. They were not distress calls, and they were not requests for military assistance from anyone. They were notifications, clean and factual, the kind you send when something expected has finally arrived after a long wait. They went to monitoring stations maintained by the Tarathi, the Soren Collective, the Delvari Empire, and 11 other old civilizations. The messages said, in their various languages, that roughly the same thing, that a Varek fleet of 40 ships had entered the Sol system, that Earth was responding according to standard protocol, and that any observers who wished to monitor the outcome were welcome to do so from a safe and comfortable distance. Not one of those civilizations sent a reply offering assistance. They never did when it came to Earth. But within hours, long-range observation drones from 4 different species were quietly repositioning themselves to watch. They did not intervene. They never intervened. They simply observed. The way you watch a fire you have seen before and already know will burn in a particular direction. Back on the Keth Mara, Drathvel reviewed the sensor data again and found nothing new to concern him. The Sol system was still showing no significant military presence, no hidden fleet, no cloaked stations, but no signatures consistent with weapons platforms powerful enough to threaten his formation. By every reading his instruments could produce, Earth remained defenseless, and the mission remained routine. He told himself the unease settling in his chest was the recycled air on the bridge, which always ran slightly dry on long deployments. He told himself that clearly and carefully, and he almost fully believed it. In the quiet of her office, Admiral Voss opened a second window on her screen and began reviewing a long list of status confirmations. Each one represented a system that had received her activation signal and had reported back with a single green indicator. She went down the list slowly, checking each one, and when she reached the bottom, she closed the window and allowed herself one small, private breath before going back to work. The 72 hours passed the way a held breath passes. Slowly at first, and then all at once, Drathvel spent those hours in preparation. His fleet moved into a standard attack formation, arcing inward toward Earth in a broad crescent, designed to maximize coverage and minimize the planet's ability to focus whatever limited defenses it possessed. He assigned targeting priorities to each ship, distributed fleet roles. I ran 3 separate battle simulations on the Keth Mara's tactical computer. All 3 simulations ended in Varric victory in under 4 hours. All 3 looked exactly as straightforward as he had expected from the beginning. He received no further communication from Admiral Voss, no renewed plea, no revised surrender offer, no last-minute attempt to negotiate better terms, just silence, steady and complete, in which he interpreted as the particular quiet of a species that had finally accepted the reality of its situation and was waiting to see if dignity in defeat was still an option. When the deadline expired, Drathvel gave the order to advance. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. The fleet moved inward and the space around them remained empty and dark and perfectly still. And Drathvel began to think that the whole thing would end even more cleanly than expected. Then every sensor on every ship in the formation screamed at the same moment. They came from everywhere, from the asteroid belt, from the shadow sides of moons, from the cold, dead spaces between orbital paths where no ship had any reason to be. They were drones, each one roughly the size of a ground car, a dark-surfaced and cold-running so that they had been nearly invisible against the thermal background of deep space. They had been sitting there dormant for years, some of them for decades, seeded through the entire solar system in numbers so large and at depths so varied that no single sensor sweep could have found them all, and no single sweep had. There were over 60,000 of them. They did not attack immediately. They activated, powered up, oriented themselves, and held position, a net of 60,000 autonomous weapons surrounding the Varric fleet on every vector, above and below the orbital plane, so packed densely enough that there was no clean escape route available in any direction without flying directly through a wall of them. Drathvel stared at his tactical display and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt the particular cold that comes not from danger alone, but from the moment when a situation reverses itself so completely that your brain requires several seconds to accept what your eyes are clearly showing it. "What is that?" he said. And it did not come out. As a question, which surprised him. "Autonomous combat drones," said Grethak, her voice flat and very careful. "Self-powered, distributed network architecture. They appear to be running a shared targeting system. If we fire on any of them, we will almost certainly trigger a simultaneous coordinated response from the entire network at once." "How long have they been here?" Grethak studied the energy signature data with the focused attention of someone trying very hard not to show what she was feeling. "The oldest signatures we are reading have been dormant for approximately 37 years. 37 years. The Varric Dominion had not been considering Earth 37 years ago. Humanity had been seeding these weapons, quietly through their own solar system for decades before any specific threat had even formed on the horizon, patient and invisible and absolutely certain that the threat would eventually come, building a trap around their own home with a patience and thoroughness that required either extraordinary fear or extraordinary experience. And looking at 60,000 powered-up drones on his screen, Drathvel was no longer certain which of the two it was. Then 3 things happened at the same time. The first was that Grethak reported cascading system failures beginning in the navigation array of the Keth Mara, then in 2 escort ships, then in 4 more in rapid succession. The failures were not from weapons fire and not from any external signal that any sensor could detect. They were internal, spreading through the ship's own systems the way water moves through cracks in stone, and the engineering teams could not stop them because the code responsible had been sitting inside Varek systems for months, inactive and completely undetected, waiting for a signal that had just been given. The second was that 17 ships in the formation reported simultaneous power fluctuations, not catastrophic, not yet, but enough to reduce weapons output and slow response coordination, enough, in a situation like this one, to matter considerably. The third was that 3 human ships decloaked inside the Varek formation. They were not warships. They were the size of heavy freight carriers, broad and unglamorous, with no visible weapon systems of any kind. They had been sitting inside the fleet's own formation since before the fleet arrived, cloaked so completely that not one Varek sensor on any of the 40 ships had registered their presence. They had traveled with the fleet, inside the fleet. Watching from the inside in perfect silence, they did not open fire. Instead, they broadcast a message directly into the Varek command channel in precise Varek military dialect. Using correct encryption codes that no outside species should have possessed, the message was from Admiral Voss. It said, "Commander Drath Vel, your navigation systems will experience full failure in approximately 40 minutes. Your weapons arrays are currently at 60% capacity and falling. You are surrounded on all vectors. We have not fired a single shot, and we would strongly prefer to keep that record. Please respond at your earliest convenience." Drathvel sat in his command, a chair, and looked at the tactical display, 60,000 drones, 3 ships that had been invisible inside his own formation, failing systems spreading through his fleet like a quiet disease that had been planted long before anyone fired the first shot, and Earth sitting there below him, blue and white and completely unhurried. As the way something is unhurried, when it has rehearsed this particular morning many times, he thought about the 11 worlds he had subjugated, about how uncomplicated each one had been, how they had all followed the same simple shape from threat to surrender. He thought about Sorvak's quiet voice in the council chamber saying the pattern is consistent every single time. He thought about the sensor sweeps that had come back too clean, too tidy, like a room where someone had hidden everything before the guest arrived. And he understood now. He had not arrived as a conqueror descending on an unprepared target. He had arrived as a guest who did not yet know that the house had been expecting him for years, that the host had spent those years making very specific preparations, and that the door he had walked through had been left unlocked on purpose. He sat with that understanding for a long and very quiet moment. Then he reached forward and opened a channel to Admiral Voss. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. He had enough pride left for that much at least. "Admiral, I am ready to discuss terms." On the other end of the channel, in a room somewhere below on that blue-green world, Admiral Voss nodded once to herself and began arranging transport. Admiral Voss came aboard the Kethmara alone. She carried no weapon that any Varek scanner could detect. She wore her uniform, the same one from the transmission, and with its quiet rows of insignia, she walked through the corridors of Drathvel's flagship with the unhurried ease of someone who had been in hostile territory before and had long since come to understand that hostile territory was simply territory that had not yet decided to be anything else. The Varek soldiers who watched her pass did not speak to her, and she did not speak to them, and the silence between them had a texture to it that none of them could quite name. Drathvel met her in the command briefing room. He had considered placing guards at the door and decided against it, not because he trusted her, but because guards would communicate something about the situation that he was not prepared to say out loud. Yet she sat down across the table from him and looked at him without hostility and without triumph, just the same measured, steady attention he had seen on the screen, the kind of attention that belongs to people who have learned to observe very carefully before they speak. Drathvel had that quality himself, and recognizing it in her made him feel, for reasons he could not fully explain, slightly worse about the entire morning. "Your systems will stabilize," she said. "The code that infected your network has a deactivation key. I am transmitting it to your engineering teams right now. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Drathvel watched his secondary display as the cascade failures slowed and stopped across the fleet. The relief from his engineering teams was audible over the open channel, and he quietly closed the channel before they could say anything undignified. I looked back at Voss. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She considered the question, not as though it was complicated, but as though she was choosing which part of a long answer to give first. "Because destroying you would have meant explaining ourselves to the Varric Dominion for the next 50 years. Managing grief at that scale is exhausting, and we have better uses for our time. It is much simpler to send you home intact and allow you to explain what happened. The explanation will do more work than any weapon." "And what did happen?" asked Drathvel. "I want to understand, not for the mission record, or for myself. What are your people?" Voss leaned back slightly in her chair. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warmth, but something that lived quietly in the space between those two things. Then she began to speak. And her voice was calm, the way the voice of someone is calm when they have explained a long thing many times and no longer feel the need to perform any emotion around it. "We come from a world that tried to kill us for a very long time," she said. "Before we had cities, before we had writing, before we had anything another species would recognize as organized civilization. We were already being hunted by animals larger and faster than us, by diseases that moved through populations without mercy, by each other in ways that were often brutal, by weather systems and ice ages and food shortages that came without warning and stayed without apology. Our planet is not a gentle place. It never was. It did not become hostile when we arrived. It was hostile first, and we arrived into that. Every other species in this galaxy that we have been able to study evolved in conditions of relative ecological stability," she continued. "Their predators were manageable. Their climates were survivable over long periods. Their food supply were reliable enough to allow whole generations to grow up without facing extinction as a personal concern. They developed intelligence as a tool for navigating a world that was difficult but not continuously and actively trying to end them. We developed intelligence as a direct response to a world that was trying to end us every single day for hundreds of thousands of years. Those are not the same thing, and they do not produce the same kind of species." Drathvel was quiet. He was listening in. And the way that you listen when something is explaining itself and you find yourself not wanting to interrupt, even though part of you would prefer to, "What I am telling you," said Voss, "is that we were shaped by pressure that most species never experienced. And things that are shaped by pressure for long enough become something different from what they were before. We do not stop when things become difficult, because stopping in difficult situations was never a strategy that worked for us. We plan for threats that have not arrived yet because waiting for a threat to arrive before preparing was never a strategy that kept anyone alive. And we remember what happened the last time and the time before that, and the time before that, because forgetting was never a strategy either." She reached into her uniform and placed a small data chip on the table between them. "That contains records from your own Dominion's historical archives. Your historians collected them over generations and then filed them in a section that nobody reads. They cover 3,000 years and 17 separate civilizations." Drathvel picked it up. "What does it show?" "It shows what happens," said Voss. "What time?" He inserted the chip into the table reader and the display lit up. Names of species he vaguely recognized from old records, dates stretching back millennia, conflict reports, economic timelines, political histories. He scrolled through slowly and read with the focused attention of a man who had already had one very bad morning and suspected the reading was about to make it worse. 17 civilizations, 17 separate attempts across 3,000 years to conquer, destroy, subdue, or even simply intimidate humanity. And not one of those civilizations existed anymore. Not one. Some had been defeated in open battle. Yes, but the majority had not ended that way. Most had collapsed from within, years or sometimes decades after their initial conflict with Earth, unraveling through political fracture, economic failure, or internal war that seemed to have nothing directly to do with humans at all until you laid all 17 cases side by side and saw the shape of it. "We did not hunt them," said Voss, reading his expression with accuracy. "We did not need to. When a species pushes against us, we respond. Completely. Thoroughly. And with everything available to us, and that response has consequences that travel further and last longer than the original conflict, it always has. We did not design it that way. It is simply what happens when you make an enemy of something that refuses to be defeated and is very good at making sure the cost of trying is one you will still be paying years later." Drathvel set the chip down and looked at her across the table. Outside the viewport, the Sol system turned in its ancients, a rhythm unhurried and vast, and Earth hung below them in the light of its yellow star, quiet and blue and completely indifferent to the fleet that had arrived to conquer it, and found itself instead sitting very still and thinking very carefully. "The elder species," he said. "The Torathi, the Soren, the Delvari, they know this. They have seen it happen," said Voss. "Some of them were present for several of these events. They do not stay away from us because they fear us." Exactly. They stay away from our enemies because being our enemy has historically been a condition that does not improve with time. And they have been around long enough to know that the kindest thing they can do for anyone who does not yet know, that is to stay out of the way and let the lesson teach itself. She stood and straightened her uniform. She looked at him one last time with that expression that was not quite pity and not quite warmth. "We never wanted this reputation. Commander, I want you to know that we did not ask to be the species the galaxy walks carefully around. We just refused, every single time, to be the species that lost. And after long enough, those two things become very difficult to tell apart." Then she asked for an escort back to the airlock, and Drathvel gave the order without speaking. Drathvel returned to Varric Prime 31 days after he had left it. He made the journey in silence. He spent most of it in his private quarters, reading and rereading the data chip Voss had given him, going through each of the 17 cases in the kind of careful detail he had not given them during that first session in the briefing room, when the morning had still been too raw to think clearly. By the time his fleet entered orbit around the capital world, he had read through all 17 cases 3 complete times, and he had stopped sleeping well. And he had not spoken to Grethak about any of it, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying the High Council received him in the Great Chamber. All 12 lords present, Vain Arak at the head, that the room vast and shadowed and heavy with the accumulated authority of 3 centuries of empire. Drathvel looked at it differently than he had before he left. He looked at it the way you look at something you have always taken for granted the moment you begin to understand that it could be taken away, not by force necessarily, but by the quieter process of consequences finding their way home. He made his report without decoration. The fleet had arrived, and the surrender broadcast had been issued, the deadline had expired, and then the following things had happened in the following order. He described the drones, the logic bombs, the 3 cloaked ships inside his formation, the offer to stand down in exchange for withdrawal. He described Admiral Voss, her manner, her words, the data chip, the 17 cases. He placed a copy of the chip on the table in front of Vain Arak and slid it forward without ceremony. The council was quiet when he finished. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. and that you can feel pressing against the room. You withdrew without engaging, said High Lord Kreeth. His voice was controlled, but the edges of it were sharp. You had 40 warships. You had weapons capable of striking the planet's surface from orbit. You retreated from a species with no visible fleet and returned home to tell us that we should be afraid of them. They had 60,000 drones, said Drathvel. You had 40 warships, said Kreeth. A louder, with failing systems, said Drathvel, and his voice did not rise. Infected months before we arrived. They had been inside our code since before we launched, and we did not know it, and we could not stop it. If we had opened fire, we would have triggered 60,000 autonomous weapons simultaneously with no ability to coordinate an effective counter-response. And we would have lost ships, many ships, and we still would not have taken the planet. And then we would have been the 18th case on that chip, and the Dominion would have spent the next 30 years finding out exactly what that means. Kreeth started to speak again, and Vainarak raised one hand just slightly, and Kreeth stopped. Tell me about the woman, said Vainarak, Drathvel told him. He told him everything Voss had said, as precisely as he could remember it. Without editorializing, he told him about the world that tried to kill them, about the pressure and the patience and the preparation that stretched back decades. He told him about the 17 cases, about how the pattern was not one of direct retaliation, but of consequence, spreading slow and far from the original conflict like cracks from a point of impact. He told him what she had said about the elder species, about why they kept their distance, and about what it meant that not one of the 17 existed anymore. When he was finished, the room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was the quiet of 12 powerful beings independently doing a particular kind of mathematics and arriving at a number none of them enjoyed. Sorvak sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He had been invited to this session for the first time in years, and he understood that the invitation was not an apology, just a recognition that the thing he had warned about had arrived. He looked at the table in front of him and was careful not to let anything show on his face that could be interpreted as satisfaction, because this was not the kind of situation anyone should feel satisfied about. I am requesting, said Drathvel, yes, that the Council file a formal withdrawal declaration and a permanent non-aggression treaty with Earth, registered with the Galactic Registry so that it is publicly visible to every species with access, not as an admission of weakness, but as a clear statement that the Dominion has assessed the situation and chosen a rational course. And I am requesting it now, before we spend another day debating options that the last 3,000 years have already thoroughly tested. The Council debated for 3 days. Kreeth argued for a second expedition with a larger fleet and better preparation. Others argued that the intelligence failure required investigation before any further action of any kind. Several lords said nothing at all and watched Vainarak's face for signs of which direction to move. On the 3rd day, Vainarak ended the debate. The withdrawal declaration would be filed, the non-aggression treaty would be drafted and registered, Earth would remain outside Dominion interest permanently. It was framed carefully and deliberately as a strategic reorientation rather than a retreat. The word defeat did not appear in any official document, but everyone in the chamber understood what it was, and no one said so out loud. But that unspoken understanding sat in the room like a guest that had not been invited and was not going to leave. The formal treaty reached Earth 3 weeks later. Admiral Voss received it in the same office where she had sent the activation instructions. She read it carefully, countersigned it, and filed it in a drawer with several others like it. Then she stood and went to the window and looked out at the gray ocean for a long time. Not in triumph, not with any performance of relief or satisfaction, just in the way that someone looks at something familiar after a long and tiring stretch of necessary work. Across the galaxy, in quiet monitoring stations and dim embassy chambers, the civilizations that had been watching received confirmation of the outcome. Soft signals passed between old species, brief and without ceremony. The kind of communication that does not require many words, because the parties have seen the same thing before and share enough history to speak in shorthand. What they said to each other in their various languages amounted to, "We watched, yes, us again." At least they were smarter than some. Let us hope they carry the lesson carefully. A Tarathi observer who had been watching from a drone positioned 2 light hours out filed her final report and added a personal note at the bottom that her superiors later removed before archiving the document. The note said, "I have observed humanity for 40 years, and I find them genuinely difficult to describe accurately. They are not the strongest species I have studied, and they are not the most ruthless. They are simply the only one I have encountered that appears to be structurally incapable of accepting that a situation is finished. Every other civilization I have watched reaches a point where it recognizes that a thing cannot be changed and adjusts accordingly. Humans appear to be missing that mechanism entirely, which sounds like a flaw until you watch what consistently happens to everyone who bets on it being 1 year later." A young Varick historian named Sarath Doe published the only fully accurate account of what had occurred in the Sol system. It was a small and careful book, not popular with the council, read slowly by the kind of people who prefer the truth over the version of events that makes everyone feel better about their place in the story. The final line of his account read, "We asked why no one challenges Earth. We should have asked why everyone who does stops."